In our session today, we are going to look at the second psalm. Psalm 2 is classified as a royal psalm. Royal psalms were psalms that had to do with the king of Israel, the king of Judah. And as such, they describe the relationship between the king and God, which is very close. The king was a representative of God. In fact, in some psalms, the king is referred to as a son of God, and that's the case with Psalm 2. And so royal psalms had to do with the reign of the king. There's a psalm about the wedding of the king. Psalm 72 is the splendor and majesty of the king. Psalm 2 would be the inauguration or the anointing of the king. Now, these psalms were also considered messianic, and some will classify them as such because you can clearly see the relationship between royal psalms and the messianic era. As we come to the first century, there's no king in Israel. There's the Roman Empire, and there is not a Messiah. There's not a monarch on the throne, and so they are looking for a Messiah. Now, I should say that a Messiah is, in Hebrew, that is an anointed one. It's a term for the king, a title. In Greek, the term is Christ. And so these messianic psalms were seen in the first century Judaism as pointing to a future king. Now, the great kings of Judah would be Solomon and David. And so in the first century, they were looking back almost 1,000 years to these great kings of the past and saying, we would love to have a king like that right now to come in and restore our sovereignty from the Romans, that we would love to have a king like Solomon with his splendor and glory and wealth and power and wisdom. And so they were longing for a Messiah, a messianic king. And so these psalms always have that overtone of both the original king of Judah as well as this first century view to a Messiah. With this psalm, I want to focus on two things. First, I want to introduce one of the themes of the book of Psalms. And second, I want to give you a method of reflecting on the Psalms. Now, one of the themes of the Psalms is the reign of God. And I think that's why this psalm, Psalm 2, is right here at the beginning, to introduce that theme, that God is absolutely sovereign. That's going to be very important throughout the rest of the Psalms, particularly as we get to the Psalms of Lament, where we're wondering why terrible things have happened. It's important to remember God's sovereignty in that case. So Psalm 2 reminds us of God's sovereignty. But secondly, I want to give you some tools for interpretation. What I call these are lenses of interpretation. We use lenses in many different ways to see things differently. We have eyeglasses, binoculars, telescopes, microscopes. Lenses allow us to see the same thing at different levels. And that's what I want to do with this series of lenses that we're going to look at. The first lens that we start with is the lens of the author. And we always start with the author and the author's intended meaning. And so in this case, we're looking at the psalm and asking ourselves, who's the author? When was it written? What was the occasion? What was going on in the world at the time or in the history of Israel? And so we look to the other books of the Bible to get that kind of information. In this case, Psalm 2, the author is David, although that's not stated with the psalm. We draw that from Acts chapter 4, where the psalm is quoted in the New Testament. The context seems to fit David quite well. It is the inauguration of his son, Solomon, I believe. Now, David, at the end of his life, was concerned about succession. He wanted to make sure that Solomon would be on the throne. David had other sons, and it needed to be clear that Solomon was the chosen to replace him. And so I think David wrote this psalm, this liturgy, for that occasion and was present when Solomon was anointed as king. And so the psalm begins with 3 verses that describe the situation on earth, that the nations are raging, the leaders are plotting together, they're conspiring to overthrow the king and God, the sovereign, the anointed one. And then the next 3 verses, verses 4 through 6, describe God's response to that, what's happening on earth. God's response from heaven is to laugh. You think this is hilarious. You're going to try to overthrow the king, Yahweh, God? That's funny. I've installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. Then the next 3 verses, verses 7 through 9, are God speaking from heaven specifically to the new king. And he says, "You are my son. Today I've become your father. Ask and I'll give you the nations as an inheritance, the ends of the earth as a possession. You're going to rule them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces like a pottery." In other words, Solomon, you're going to have power and authority. It's yours. I'm giving it to you. You are my son. You are my reflection, my agent on this earth. The final three verses are instructions then back to someone from earth speaking wisdom to the kings and the authorities that would rebel against Solomon. And it says, "Be wise, you kings, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Kiss the Son, honor him, or it's not going to go well for you." So that's the original context of the song. Solomon was installed as king so that he could represent God's activity on earth. He could represent God's glory, God's power, God's wisdom, God's authority, God's judgment. And this leads us to our next lens, actually, is theology. What is this psalm telling us about God? And one of the things is that God reigns. God is sovereign. He sits enthroned in heaven. That's a way of saying he is the absolute sovereign of the universe. But secondly, he also reigns through us, through people, I should say, through the king. The king is his agent, his Messiah, to accomplish his purposes on earth. So God is not a distant deity, but he is one who gets involved. He's active in the affairs of men. It also tells us that he is just. The psalm speaks of justice, of nations being smashed, of rebels being struck down. So God is just, but the other side of God's justice is that he is a blessing to those who take refuge in him. He's a blessing to the poor, to the needy, to the oppressed. That's all there as well. So God is just, he is sovereign, and he is active in the affairs of men. So the theological lens is when we look at a psalm and ask ourselves, what does this psalm tell me about the nature of God? Our third lens is what I call the lens of the editor. Now, the Psalms were compiled probably sometime in the 5th century, and there was an editor that did that. There was someone that ordered the Psalms and passed them down as they are to us today. And this is asking the question, why is Psalm 2 Psalm 2? Why was it placed in that location? Now, I think one of the reasons is to assert that theme right from the beginning, that the Lord reigns, God is sovereign. The question of the editor also asked us, what about the psalm before and the psalm after? Is there a connection in the ordering of the psalms? And if you look at Psalm 1, in fact, there are several connections to Psalm 2. They share some of the same language. There is a way, there are scoffers, there's a seat, there's stand, there's similar language. There's even the word meditate. In Psalm 1, we're told to meditate on the law of God. In Psalm 2, we're told that the nations are meditating on how to overthrow the rule of God. And so in some ways, there is contrast being presented here. That what is true of the individual in Psalm 1, that if you meditate on the law of God, you'll be blessed. If you don't, you'll be like chaff. Psalm 2 says what is true of the individual is also true of the nation, of the society. If a society meditates to overthrow the rule of God, the text says they're going to perish. But on the other hand, those who trust in God will be blessed. He'll be a refuge to them. And so when we look at other Psalms through the lens of the editor, we're looking to see about the Psalms before and after. Are there connections between them? And it's a fascinating study to see how, in fact, there are. That the book of Psalms, I think, is one masterful narrative from beginning to end. That the editor is telling a story through the connections of these Psalms. The fourth lens is probably my favorite, the Jesus lens. And this is where we try to see Jesus in this psalm. We ask ourselves the question, did Jesus quote this psalm? Does this psalm make us think of anything about the life of Jesus? And so we're looking at the Gospels, Jesus' teaching, Jesus' actions, and seeing if there's any correspondence. And in the very first few pages of the Gospels, we find one. We find at Jesus' baptism, there is a voice from heaven, very much like Psalm 2, that says, "This is my Son." That voice is repeated again at Jesus' transfiguration, just a few months before his crucifixion. In fact, Peter, on that occasion, says, the good confession. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Very clear in my connection then that Jesus is the ultimate king. He is the Messianic king. He is, as Jesus said himself, one greater than Solomon that is now here. The Jews of the first century were looking for a Messiah like David, like Solomon. And Jesus comes, he's introduced to us in Matthew's gospel as the Son of David. Jesus is the Messianic king, and everything about the Gospels illuminates for us what that Messianic king looks like. That's the Jesus lens. And that leads us to the fifth lens, and I call this the lens of the New Testament, or the lens of the apostles, the lens of the church. This is how the early church understood this psalm and applied this psalm. Now, thankfully, this psalm is quoted a couple of times in the New Testament, so that's the first place you want to go. The New Testament quotes it and interprets it for us. We have a pretty good clue of how they understood it. In this case, we have this psalm used in Acts chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. The context is this: the church has just begun to experience persecution. And James and John have been told by the Sanhedrin, you cannot preach in the name of Jesus anymore. They take that news back to the church. The church opens up the book of Psalms, Psalm 2, and they begin to pray, why do the nations rage? Why do the peoples plot in vain? The whole psalm is not recorded in Acts, but I'm sure they sang all 12 verses of this psalm. And it says that when they did so, they realized that what had happened to Jesus, suffering under Pontius Pilate, was exactly what was supposed to happen. That God was indeed sovereign, and that there is no way that God's rule can be resisted. Pontius Pilate, the Romans, the Sanhedrin, these authorities of men that were raging against the Messiah were destined to lose. They would collapse like pottery being smashed. And they left that place. It says that the place was shaken, and they left and they preached and taught with boldness because they were convinced, because of Psalm 2 and its message, that they could not fail. The church of Jesus Christ would not fail. They would win no matter what. This psalm introduces this very important truth that God's sovereignty is so absolute that even his enemies find themselves working out his purposes. The enemies of Jesus, Pontius Pilate, the Roman government, the Sanhedrin, these were the enemies of Jesus, and yet they found themselves working out God's plan for Jesus. That's how great God's sovereignty is. And the New Testament church was convinced of that, and I believe that's what gave them their boldness. And anytime they had any doubt, they could just open up Psalm 2, and they could pray that again and remember that God is sitting enthroned in heaven, and he laughs at the futile attempts for people to resist his sovereignty. This brings us to our final lens, and I call this the personal lens, me. This is what this psalm says to me in this moment in my life. You may read it 1 year and then come back in another circumstance, and there's another meaning that jumps out at you. So it's that personal application of the psalm that I'm talking about. And in this case, it is such good news to know that no matter what happens in this world, no matter how much upheaval there might seem to be, that God reigns. God is seated, enthroned in heaven, and he laughs at the attempts of leaders, of worldviews to resist his truth. Reality. Reality always wins. And the reality is that God is in heaven, and his law, his way is right, it is true. And when we say with the nations, let's throw off their chains, let's release those the law, the restrictions that God has placed on us, the boundaries that he's placed on us. That's in verse 3. God laughs at that. It's futile to resist the natural law. The laws that God has established will only end up breaking ourselves. So be encouraged. No matter what you're going through in life, God's got this. He's in charge. He is sovereign. And if you're on the front lines, if you're a kingdom worker who's in a very dark place where it seems like the principalities and powers are aligned against you and against the kingdom, be encouraged by this psalm that that's not the case at all, that God sits enthroned in heaven and he laughs, and the principalities and powers and worldviews that stand against the church, They're hollow. They are as brittle as pottery that can be smashed by the Messiah. So take courage in this. This method of looking at the Psalms, I have found to be tremendously fruitful in my meditation over the years. And I would encourage you, as you read each Psalm, to read the Psalm 6 times. And each time, look for each one of these. Look at it through these lenses. Ask those kinds of questions. Who's the author? When did he write it? What's going on in their life? What does the Psalm say about God, theologically speaking? Why is the Psalm ordered the way it is, the editor? What does the Psalm tell me about Jesus, and how did Jesus pray this Psalm? And the New Testament, does the New Testament speak to this? Is there similar language between the New Testament and the Psalm that would make a connection? And finally, how does this apply to me? How is this going to make my life different today? And I trust that you'll be blessed if you'll apply this method as you pray and reflect and study the Psalms.